Hi, I'm Rowan Moore. I'm architecture critic of The Observer, and you're listening to US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Celebrities in Hollywood aren't huge fans of modernist architecture. Most of them prefer a 1930s mansion or an Italianate villa. But there are a few, like Jennifer Aniston, Holland Taylor, Caan, Kelly Lynch, Leonardo DiCaprio, and others who keep modernist houses in the spotlight. Today, we'll talk with Alison Martino, producer, historian, and preservationist, the godmother of old Hollywood in Los Angeles. Next up, Frank Sinatra expert Bill Boggs, and later, we'll learn about the modernist town of Columbus, Indiana, from author Matt Shaw, who's out with a new book. And now, here's your host, the modfather of modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Los Angeles is a love letter to modernism. While Hollywood glamour and celebrity mansions often steal the spotlight, it's the mid-century modern homes that truly capture the city's imagination. These architectural marvels, with their clean lines, flat roofs, and walls of glass, are a testament to a bygone era that's still very highly prized. There's John Lautner's Chemisphere, perched atop the Hollywood Hills. Pierre Koenig's Stahlhaus, a.k.a. the Case Study House No. 22, which is a masterpiece of glass and steel, and for me, the best small house in Los Angeles. There's another Lautner creation, Silvertop, with a commanding view of Silver Lake and an engineering marvel all by itself. LA's mid-century modernist homes are exceptionally well-preserved time capsules that transport us to an era of optimism. Remember optimism? That's that feeling that the future is going to be better than the past. I think we lost the last of that around the year 2000. Recently, I learned that many of U.S. Modernist Radio's listeners have never been to the U.S. Modernist archives. So here's a tip. We have thousands of houses, about 23,000, documented at usmodernist.org/masters by the most famous architects: Wright, Neutra, Schindler, Lautner, Elwood, Soriano, and dozens more. Fair warning, though, this is a huge rabbit hole, a compelling time sink, a massive distraction from all the work you've got to do today.
See you later.
I love getting email timestamped 3 a.m. from people who started browsing at 9 p.m. and could not stop. Thank you very much. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Returning podcast guest Alison Martino is the godmother of Hollywood history, especially the heyday of the studios, 1945 to 1975, which also matched the heyday of modernism. Many Hollywood stars, which she met growing up and has remained close to since, commissioned modernist houses in Los Angeles and Palm Springs. If her last name sounds familiar, she's the daughter of singer Al Martino, famous for the song Spanish Eyes, and his 1972 portrayal of Johnny Fontaine in The Godfather. Allison and her Jeopardy-level knowledge of celebrity history has been featured in dozens of publications, from the LA Magazine to the Hollywood Reporter to the New York Times. She's been featured in ABC's Eye on LA, NPR, The Insider, Bizarre Foods, Spectrum News Channel, and many more. And she's produced E's Mysteries and Scandals, Trading Spaces, and Celebrity Rehab. And she's also produced documentaries on Jane Mansfield and Pierre Cardin. Her Facebook page, Vintage Los Angeles, has a huge following. And best of all, she loves modernist houses, and she has one in LA and Palm Springs. And her mom, Judy, is just delightful. Welcome, Allison.
Wow, what an introduction. Hi.
So one of the things I really love about your social media and the things that you do is that you pull up memories that I think I only have, but evidently lots of people have. Like, for instance, most recently, you were talking with Sid Croft, I think, and you were reminiscing about the Bugaloos, which didn't even last but a couple of years in the 70s. And I remember having a giant crush on Joy, one of the Bugaloos, who I think became a therapist.
I don't know. I child of the 70s, so I grew up on all the Sid and Marty Krofft shows, and Sid and I have become very friendly in the last couple of years. And I interviewed him at the LA Breakfast Club last week, and we had like 250 people come. It was 7:00 in the morning. Tradition over there that's been almost 100 years. They've been doing the LA Breakfast Club, and Sid is 95.
Holy cow.
I think my very first Halloween costume was Joy Boogaloo.
Yeah.
He's just the sweetest guy, and you just don't realize how much he's done. I have this show on Spectrum News, and I interview a lot of really great people that I have admired my whole life. And this Thursday, I have interviewing Ed Ruscha.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, which was a big interview for me to get. And he has an amazing exhibit here at LACMA of, I think, every piece of art he's ever done is there. First time in history in his career, they had curators that found everything. I mean, yes, there's stuff that he did that's there, but private collectors that have been collecting his art since the 60s, maybe even late 50s, have their pieces on loan for this. So
he's buddies with Frank Gehry, I believe, who designed a house for him somewhere.
Yeah, he actually lives in Truesdale. I grew up in Beverly Hills. I was born in 70. And Truesdale Estates was just coming up, a new development. Beverly Hills is an old development, house being built there in the 20s. Truesdale was starting to come up in the 60s and really not that popular at the time. We, of course, didn't call them mid-century modern homes because we called them
homes.
Contemporary.
We just called them homes.
Contemporary, I think, was the word, because they weren't for everyone. If you were an old Beverly Hills resident, you lived there for 30 years, you liked an old traditional house or, farm-like house or a French Normandy house. There's a lot of different houses, but those modern homes were new. And he lives in one of those. Ed Ruscha now lives in one of those amazing mid-century homes in Truesdale, which is now probably the most sought after homes in all of Beverly Hills. Isn't that funny how that turned around?
It really is. It really is.
Yeah. It's come full circle in a way. I miss that era. I miss growing up in the 70s, which is why I felt so compelled to get a place in Palm Springs, because it felt like a Truesdale to me. It felt like the flat, like the Truesdale is very hilly and it's like the Hollywood Hills, but Palm Springs has that feel of like mid-century suburbia.
It certainly does, doesn't it?
All the homes are in uniform, and I love that, where I walk outside of my community in Canyon Estates and, every house is a similar design and nothing is in your face or if it's too big for the property. And today they're tearing down Beverly Hills houses left and right and building all house coming right up to the street. They have no driveway. They have no landscaping. And I tend to be more modest, a modernist, modern, maybe that goes together, but I like a little more modest home. I don't like a big garish. I don't like the way that looks. That's changed a lot in Beverly Hills. We've lost a lot of beautiful modernist homes through the years for these big, huge, I don't know what they're called, embassies.
Hotels, really.
Yeah, they look like embassies. They look like hotels. They look like there's one that went up that actually really does look like a museum. That's not a house. I don't know how people live in that. But anyway, we went from Sid Croft to this. So
now, another person who passed away the last couple of years who had extensive knowledge of Hollywood. I don't know if you ever talked with him much, but I did, and that was Gilbert Gottfried. Did you know Gilbert well?
Yeah, I did, and I was supposed to go on that show. And then he passed away, which was just so sad. I guess I did not realize he was sick like that. Yeah, him and his partner, Frank, they love pop culture, architecture, and he is just an unbelievable person of knowledge. And I wish that he was still with us, because you got to talk to him and yourself and be friends.
We had dinner one night.
Oh, nice.
And he just told the most crazy stories. The one he told a lot on his podcast was about Cesar Romero and these boys that he would hire to throw orange slices at him. And it was just crazy.
I grew up with a lot of comedians, with my dad being a singer and being on the road. A lot of comedians opened up for Dad. I grew up with a lot of shenanigans in the house.
I bet you did.
Joey Bishop and Buddy Hackett used to come over and they try to make each other laugh, and one had to be funnier than the other. And then Dad said, well, I'll outdo them all. And he would make like calamari and he put rubber bands in there. It's like one was in on it, one wasn't in on it. And they didn't understand why it was tasting like that. And I have 1,000 stories. It was very, very fun. And Maury Amsterdam, who was a really good friend of Dad's, probably had the greatest mid-century house I've ever seen. It's still, of course, they tore it down.
Oh, I was going to ask where it was.
It was in Truesdale, and it was a Japanese style mid-century. Boat around it and just beautiful mid-century accents that were on the Japanese side. It looked like it looked like a movie set. It's inside. He had it just so modernist, and a lot of that furniture influenced me because he also had a lot of wallpaper.
Okay.
This dining room and living room had the same wallpaper. And it was like a green bamboo, yellow bamboo through the green. And I loved it. I have been looking for that wallpaper ever since. So when I got the Palm Springs house, I was determined to sort of do a homage to Maury's wallpaper. I found something similar.
Maury Amsterdam was on the Dick Van Dyke Show and had a great camaraderie with fellow actor Rose Marie, who I assume you ran into at some point. She was around forever.
One of the biggest highlights of my career was interviewing Rose Marie at the, it was the Aero Theater. I interviewed Rose Marie at the Aero Theater with Dick Van Dyke, Carl Reiner, and Peter Marshall all together. I was
at the same time. Wow.
Yeah. I interviewed 4 of them at the same time. And I remember I was terrified, not that I'm nervous to be around them, that I wanted to do a good job for them, and how can I be at all funny when you have the 4 funniest people on the stage? And I asked one question and they just went. And for 45 minutes, I got back into the audience and took a seat. But to be up there with them was incredible. And yes, Rose Marie was a good friend also. We've just lost so many. And, now that I'm looking back on that stage, I mean, Dick Van Dyke is the one we have. Thank God he's still with us.
Yes.
I just lost our dear friend, Peter Marshall, about 2 weeks ago. That was really hard. And I just lost my friend Lou Bracker, who passed away. And I interviewed him during Modernism. He was very good friends with James Dean.
James Darren passed away, right?
Look, they're all hard because they're all friends and they're all artists that we've admired for years, whether it's their movies, their music, their comedy. They added so much to pop culture and the 20th century growing up. And they were also friends. So my dad and James Darren were from the same, they're from South Philly. So they were real Italian guys from the streets, and they didn't have much of a child. Well, my dad was in World War II, so he never had a childhood. He left for the war when he was 16, which you can imagine.
Yeah.
Back then they weren't checking IDs. They were like, come on, and you could get somebody to pose as your father, pay him $10 and say you're my dad. I want to get in. He was 16. But James Darren and Dad are on a mural together out in Philly because there's a lot of singers came out of Philadelphia. You have Eddie Fisher and James Darren and Al Martino, Mario Lanza, Chubby Checker. James Darren was godfather to Nancy Sinatra's daughters.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
They were very close. And Palm Springs always comes in and out of my life because the last time I saw Jimmy Darren was in Palm Springs. And that's the other person I forgot to say is from Philadelphia, Frankie Avalon.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, Jimmy Darren and Frankie Avalon were together and they did an interview over in this club in Palm Springs, and we got to see them and they were just in the best shape. And I mean, Frankie's amazing. I spoke to him recently and he's fabulous. Dad discovered Frankie Avalon and he will verify that. Dad was about 20 something years old and he was going to be on the Jackie Gleason show in New York. And Frankie was a trumpet player. And he would always go to the parties around South Philly and play the trumpet for people at these record parties and stuff. Dad thought he was amazing and told Jackie about him. Jackie put him on the show. And that was it. He became Frankie Avalon. I mean, I don't think anyone realized he started as a horn player.
No, I had no idea.
He got the bug, obviously, by, performing. And he came out to Hollywood and, my God, landed all the beach movies and that incredible time in his life. A lot of talent came out of Philadelphia, and talent continues to come through LA and Palm Springs.
Well, let's talk about Palm Springs because Hollywood essentially abandoned the town in the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah.
Are they coming back now?
No, here's the thing. I mean, Palm Springs was always for someone who grew up in LA, always a getaway place. And I was of the age in the 80s in high school where probably wasn't the best time to like take your kids there because they had the spring break issues where the kids, like a couple of years older than me were kind of crazy on the streets and shaving cream. And, like it was a spring break kind of young people. And I don't know, I think Sonny Bono I think he put a stop to it.
The cruising up and down the streets. Yeah.
Like, okay, maybe a little bit of looking like a college town, and I think that it turns some people off from going there on vacation. This is just from my point of view, because I remember my parents stopped going a little bit in the late 80s. So yeah, I don't know. And then, gosh, I would say in 2000, 2001-ish, I'm not sure exactly when the first modernism started, because it's been around a while.
20 years, yes.
So I think I went to my first one in 2007, maybe. I hate the word say obsessed, but I've always been so fascinated by anything mid-century modern and that whole era and everything that comes with it. And I remember Huell talking about the Lautner house out there that were in Diamonds and Forever. And he was going to go during modernism. I don't know if he was going to speak there. I think he spoke there, and I got a ticket. And I went, and that was my first modernism. That was my first taste of, wow, there's a lot of this architecture out here that they appreciate it much more than, I'm not saying Hollywood doesn't appreciate it. I think they do. But the people that come in and move here may not appreciate it. They just want the land and tear down these incredible structures that you're never going to ever see again. Once they're gone, they're gone. And thankfully, there's LA Conservancy and, people like you, and even Vintage LA has helped create awareness so people understand if you're going to take something down, can we just explain a little bit of what you're taking down and the history that's attached to? And can you please go do that somewhere else? I'm not saying it's going to work, but I thought that Palm Springs was a place that I wanted to at least explore, to live in at some point, maybe even later in my life, live there full time, because I like being around like-minded people like myself that believe in preservation and are proud of their homes and want to show off their homes. And their interiors are just as beautiful as their exteriors. And they're not trying to outdo each other with, I hate to say it, wealth. The wealth in LA has gotten so grotesque. I'm speaking of like Beverly Hills, tearing down these beautiful, maybe one-story mid-century homes.
Up in the bird streets, they're building these really monster houses.
Big time, too big for the streets, and I don't like that feeling where I'm driving through the streets and the houses are coming in on me. I always like the house that sits back a little bit. And Palm Springs just does not feel at all like it's, and I'm sure there's parts of it that there are people that are upset with something they're doing, but it's not at all on the scale of Los Angeles, because LA, I think they're going through like an architectural nervous breakdown. They're just taking down everything. The history is going to be lost. And like I said, where are the tourists going to go?
Where are they going to go? I know.
You're going to go to a club. You're going to go to a rock and roll place. Okay, so if we're going to take out every club, that's no fun just staying in a hotel. You might as well go to Las Vegas. All we're missing is the monorails on the strip now. It's like every hotel looks the same. Every lobby looks the same. There's no activity. There's nowhere to go. Luckily, places like the Rainbow, the Roxy, the Whiskey A Go-Go, those are landmarked because they're owned by people who have owned the property, thank God, and they can do whatever they want with their property when they own it. When they don't own it is when we're in trouble, right?
Right.
But people that own their homes and sell them for these ridiculous amounts of money, it just seems like they're not buying the house. They're buying the land.
That happened recently with Chris Pratt buying an Elwood house for $12 million and tearing it down.
And what a backlash he received, rightfully so. That is a beautiful house that did not need to be demolished. I mean, what was he thinking? I don't know. And I'm not one of those people that says, if you own your home, you have the right to do what you want, right? I get that. No, we're not like that. Just don't buy one that everyone loves and take it down. That's all I'm saying. You want to take down a house, there's a ton of teardowns around here, I'm sure, that you could take down. But one that was that beloved in the neighborhood, it's the same thing with the Roxbury, the 1001 Roxbury on Roxbury Drive here in Beverly Hills.
Is that the Paul Williams house?
He was involved with it. It wasn't one of his houses,
okay.
But he did restore a few things at one point. It's on 3 lots. It was across the street from Lucille Ball. And it was the most beautiful house in the neighborhood. Ask anybody. It looked like a park. It was absolutely gorgeous. And the guy from StubHub came in and $48 million or $38 million and tore it down. And let me tell you, he tore it down 2 years ago. It's still down. Why? Why'd you have to do that? And, and we fought him and fought him and fought him of 100 city council meetings. He knew he'd be the most hated person in the neighborhood. He didn't care. Those people trip me out. I certainly wouldn't want to be the most hated person in the neighborhood. And I wouldn't take down a house that everybody loves. Like I said, once it's gone, it's gone. You can't build it back. I could go on and on about architecture in LA and how we're losing way too much. Never seen it like this, George. I'm born and raised here. I've never seen anything like this. When I was growing up in Beverly Hills, I know that sounds like, oh, you grew up in Beverly Hills. We didn't know any billionaires. I don't even think they existed. We knew showbiz people like, Gene Kelly or Edward G. Robinson lived across the street from us. Jack Lemmon, you'd see him get like 10-cent ice cream cones at Thrifty. This was not a town when I was growing up that was all about wealth. A lot of these actors and Hollywood showbiz people had lived there for years and years and years, probably bought their houses for $40,000.
Wow.
Now they're worth $25 million.
Mm.
And that did not happen when I was growing up at all. We still had a J.J. Newberry, and Rodeo Drive didn't look anything like it did. And we weren't obsessed with labels. We were a little village, and now if everyone says, if I'd only hung on to my house, in the 80s, it's $25 million, but I guarantee you when someone like Gene Kelly came to Beverly Hills, he probably bought his house above Sunset for $60,000.
Well, tell me what you're up to. I know you've had a busy summer and you've got a series coming out.
Well, I've been on my Spectrum show for 5.5 years. I've just recently hit 100 episodes, which has been so incredible.
Nice.
And now we've branched off into a new series. It'll probably be 5 episodes. And it's the history of dive bars. And every week we go to a different dive bar and we get the story. It's not really about alcohol. Some of these dive bars have been around for 50 years, 60 years, owned by the same owners. And I'm all about chasing story. I want to know who's come in and who sat where. I was just sitting with a bar owner the other day at Shay J, talking about how Julie Andrews was proposed to there by Blake Edwards. And, stories like that, I just adore them. And I love to document as much as I can before it's too late, because these are the kind of stories you can't read in a book.
No.
I find bar owners to be probably the most fascinating people in the world. I mean, everyone comes into a restaurant bar, and I'm doing dive bars, regular bars, restaurants that have been around 50, 60 years. They got the stories.
The restaurant I really want to go to, and the name is escaping me, but I know you'll know it, where they have the very senior wait staff and they're all in uniforms and it's old school furniture. And Michael Douglas filmed a lot in his recent series in there.
Musso and Frank?
Musso and Frank, yes.
I'm going there right after we get off the phone.
Really?
I'm going to Musso and Frank. I have a 7:30 reservation.
Oh my God, I'd love to be there with you. I've always wanted to go there.
There's no place like it on the planet Earth. It is literally walking into a time capsule of the 1920s. It's really any decade you want it to be, because it's never changed in 105 years. And yes, it's very traditional with the wait staff, and they're wonderful, and best steak in, I don't know, West Coast. I'm sure the East Coast will compete, but they really do have a fabulous steak. And it's just the wood paneling and the red leather booths, and just knowing there's an Orson Welles booth, and there's a Sinatra booth, and there's a Steve McQueen stool at the bar. And, all this stuff is documented. It's not made up, where a lot of restaurants you'll go in, this was Frank Sinatra's favorite restaurant. If I had a number every time someone said, Frank Sinatra came here all the time, this really was the Hollywood hub. It's right there on Hollywood Boulevard, right near the studios, right near Capitol Records. And, that's where the Pacific Red Car train used to come in and drop people off right there. And it's incredible that it's still there. Probably the most historic restaurant on the West Coast. So you must come with me next time.
I must do that. Allison, I just want to thank you on behalf of all the preservationists out there across the country, because what you do through your social media and your reporting is bringing awareness for sites many times that wouldn't be there. And so you're doing a great public service.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I do feel that there is a great public service in social media. I think it's one of the best things to ever happen for people like us. because we're passionate about subjects. We're able to get the word out. We're able to stop demolition sometimes. We're able to get the word out a lot faster than throwing flyers all over, which I'll still do. I'll still put a flyer under everyone's door. But there's something about the spreading the message on Facebook and everyone sort of spreading it around together has been great. And you too. I mean, you do amazing work. You are such an incredible encyclopedia knowledge of everything mid-century. I think you should be interviewed next time.
I'm just a paperback compared to your encyclopedic knowledge, I tell you.
We are good at what we do, I think, and you're good at what you do. And at one point, going to turn the camera around and someone's got to interview you, my friend.
That was George talking with Alison Martino. A Philadelphia native, Bill Boggs' career kicked off at WKYW-TV, and it's included hosting, writing, and producing numerous TV shows, alongside acting roles in Miami Vice, Oz, Trading Places, and The Devil's Advocate. He's an expert on old Blue Eyes, Frank Sinatra, and got to know him well before his death in the 90s. As fans recall, Frank had a modernist house in Palm Springs that he shared with Ava Gardner during their tumultuous relationship. It's still there, and you can visit it during Modernism Week and other special events during the year. Here's George's conversation with Bill Boggs.
Bill, I asked you to be on the show to talk about Sinatra, but as I learned more about you, you have quite an incredible career yourself in music, in television, in movies, in interviewing, in food. I mean, it just goes on and on.
And writing. You know, I've written 4 books, and I've been a writer since I was a little child. I used to do cartoon drawings of underwater life, and I've been using whatever small gifts I have, I've been using all my life. And I'm grateful that I've had an opportunity to take advantage of using them. I wake up every morning, George, and the first thing I do is count the things I'm grateful for, you know.
Well, it's our pleasure. You've been very good about following up with us. We had tried to do this last year, and getting together with you now is just fascinating. I mean, I'm just reading about all the different things you were involved in. For instance, you were involved with Tom Patchett and Jay Tarses, who went on to write for the classic series like Bob Newhart and Mary Tyler Moore.
Well, I didn't write for Mary Tyler Moore. The Patchett and Tarses were the comedy team. And when we split up, so I could finally get on television, which was my lifelong goal after 3.5 years of managing and launching the careers of and launching my career in show business, they went from me managing them from my parents' house with a black rotary phone to one of the most powerful managers in show business, Bernie Brillstein. So we accomplished our goals. And then they went on to write for Newhart and Mary Tyler Moore.
Now, how did you get acquainted with Frank Sinatra personally? When's the first time you met him?
Well, the first time I met him, I really didn't become acquainted with him. The second time I met him, I became very acquainted with him. So the first time I met Sinatra was with my friend, the late, great Norman Steinberg, who wrote My Favorite Year and was executive producer, excuse the expression, of the Bill Cosby Show and was a writer with Mel Brooks for Blazing Saddles. And we said that back when we met in Ocean City, at the end of the summer, we knew that the group of kids would never be back together again. You know, we're going off to graduate from college that year. So he and I shook hands, standing in the surf at Ocean City, New Jersey, and said, if Sinatra ever comes east, no matter where we are, we'll go to see him. Meaning that we're fans who wanted to see Frank perform live, which he wasn't doing much of then except for Florida and Vegas. So I read in Variety that Sinatra was going to be at the Eden Rock Hotel performing. I got the date. And Norman said the day that his opening is the day I get out of the basic training. So we made arrangements to meet at the airport. I flew down to wherever, Fort Lauderdale. He flew there. And prior to doing this, of course, I wanted to get reservations to see the show. That really makes sense, which I couldn't do. I sent 3 letters to the maitre d', whose name I found out by calling the hotel. And in each one, I included a money order as a tip, hoping for special consideration, right? I heard nothing. So Norman says to me, what about the reservations? I said, look, we don't have reservations. And if they don't let us in, I got 2 busboy jackets packed in my suitcase, and we'll sneak in the back door as busboys. like I did at the 500 Club in Atlantic City, New Jersey. When I saw Frank for the first time, I walked in through the kitchen because I couldn't get a reservation. I couldn't afford it anyway. So we go and we're in line. We're all dressed up, two clean-looking guys. Right? We get to the maitre d', and he says, "Reservation?" I said, "Well, we don't have a reservation." Well, I said, "I'm Bill Boggs." And he says, "William Boggs III?" I said, "Yep, that's how I signed my letters in those days." And then he looks at Norman. He says, "And this must be your friend." And I say, "Norman," because I've written out the whole story for him. And he snaps his fingers and says, "Table 26. So we see Frank. He's with Quincy Jones. Everything is phenomenal. We're out in the town after Frank did the early show. And we're at a place, and we're talking up a couple of women at the bar. They happen to be the Barry sisters, a singing act. And they said, if we hear Sinatra's having a dinner party for several of his friends down here in the Mona Lisa room at 2 o'clock in the morning. Really? I said, "What's the Mona Lisa room?" "Well, it's normally a restaurant, but on normal nights it closes like at midnight, but they're keeping it open for Frank." I said, "You mean it will be open?" "Yeah." She says, "Okay." So about 11:45, Norman and I go to the Mona Lisa room. Walk in, sit at the bar. There's two other people across from us, a honeymoon couple. On the stroke of two, Sinatra at his table walk in, sit down. They acknowledge us, we wave. And Bill Miller, his pianist, is there. And so this is cool. He and Norman and I, we've seen Frank, and this is great. It's the middle of the night, and we're having Jack Daniels, and so is he. So about an hour in, when they finished, I think, the second chorus, two guys wheeled the piano over to his table, which was a long table with about 12 people at it, put a candelabra on it, and Sinatra got up and sang 4 songs to us, his guests and the 4 of us at the bar. And then when this was over, and I could go into what that was like, hearing Frank with no microphone singing ballads in deep concentration. He wasn't doing anything as a throwaway. And when we all applauded, it sort of roused him out of it. So when the things were breaking up, Norman and I dashed out the door, waiting to say hello to Frank. And Frank came out. I said, "Oh, Frank, thank you very much. That was terrific." He says, "That was fun, wasn't it?" And then said, "What happened to you?" Because I had a cast on my arm. And I told him, playing baseball, I rounded first base and tripped and broke my wrist. And that's the first time I met Sinatra.
And you met him many times over your career and interviewed him quite a few times.
No, I interviewed Frank once. It's the longest interview of his life. That's because I met him at 4 o'clock in the morning at the Caesar's Palace. I was going to L.A., but I stopped in Las Vegas because Frank was performing, and I was able to get a very good reservation because at this point I had stature. I was on television and stuff. That night, after my friends all went to bed, I was still so revved up. I was walking around the casino. I ran into Jilly Rizzo, Sinatra's right-hand man. And Jilly, who was an extremely accommodating guy, knew of a favor I had done for Sammy Davis Jr. before that. It kind of like made me with him. And he says, "Would you like to meet Frank?" And I said, "Absolutely." He said, "Come over to the Galleria Lounge about 4 o'clock. I'll introduce you." So at 4 o'clock, I go. There's Sinatra, this tuxedo, a couple beautiful blondes, Jack and Trotta from the Sands. Jilly brings me up. He waits for the right time and whispers in Frank's ear, whatever. And Frank looks up with his cobalt blue eyes and says, "Hey, Billy, how you doing?" And we talked that night for about 7-8 minutes about his act, his company. He was coming back from a 2-year retirement. I said, people love cycles. They love that life. He said they're both still in the book, meaning he could still do them. And then I told him that my mother had been a Bobby Soxer. I told him about sneaking into the 500 Club, which made the newspaper. He said, "You're the guy." Yeah. So he concluded the conversation by saying, "This is Easter, March. This is March."
What year was this, Bill?
75. Frank Sinatra says to Bill Boggs, "Look, I'm going to be in New York in September at the Uris. I don't want to promise you, but maybe I'll swing by and do your show." And he did. So I never even asked. My hands went up and said, "Frank, I'm not asking you for anything." And he took my hand down and he said, "I know, Bill. I know you're not asking. Maybe I'll come." And he did. That's my Frank Sinatra stories for this broadcast.
Well, how did you become such an expert in Sinatra and following him over his career?
Well, I snuck into the 500 Club to see him. And over the course of his career, that was 1960 until 1994, by the count that I can remember, I saw him live 82 times. I took my mother several times. I took friends. I just wanted to expose him to people, his live performances. I think it was not difficult to learn much about Frank Sinatra. There have been dozens of books written about him, some exaggerated, some not. So when you say learning about him, I learned about him through his music. And it's interesting, if you look at the great singers like Bing Crosby, Nat King Cole, you really don't hear much about them. But Sinatra has endured because of the way he affected people emotionally.
Well, let's go back. For people that don't know Frank Sinatra, and there are a lot of them who are very young, give us a Sinatra 101, Bill.
Well, so Frank Sinatra had the ability to inhabit a song and make you feel like he was singing it just to you, both on the record, on vinyl, and in live performances. And that emotional connection essentially made him a superstar. And that's why he endured.
And he got his start in the 40s, right? And he was instantly famous.
At the end of the 30s, he started his career from Hoboken, New Jersey. Was quickly picked up by the Harry James Orchestra and then the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra after that.
And he went on to star in movies early on and became...
Yeah, he made about 60 movies and all of them made money.
Yeah.
Recorded 1,500 songs. Sold a lot of albums, singles, a lot of hits. Not as many hits as, say, Nat King Cole, who was a huge star at that same time. Nat had a lot of charted hits because he wrote some of them and he really could spot a pop song.
And he was working quite a bit with Jimmy Van Heusen.
Well, Jimmy Van Heusen is a librettist. He writes some music. And Sammy Caan is a lyricist. And they wrote some notable Academy Award-winning songs like All the Way and album covers like Come Fly With Me. And, if he needed something, they'd write it for him.
So you also interviewed a number of Frank's friends at the time. You interviewed Sammy Davis Jr., right? And Dean Martin?
No, I never interviewed Dean Martin. I interviewed Joey Bishop.
Joey Bishop.
And I interviewed Peter Lawford, yeah.
I've always been curious about Joey Bishop. He seemed kind of the most distracted of Frank's Rat Pack.
Yeah, well, that was his role. Frank described him as the wheel that runs things when they were doing on-stage performances. Joey helped construct the act using elements of Martin and Lewis and some original comedy that he wrote. He was just a friend of Frank's. They were friends to the end.
And now that Frank has been gone since 1998, how has his reputation grown?
His reputation has grown, or has endured, I would say. He's relevant still.
What are some of your favorite hits of his?
Well, my personal theme song is That's Life. That's What All the People Say. You're riding high in April. Shot down in May. I like a song called I'll Remember April. When the World Was Young. I love that. And Where or When, live. Love that. There's a lot to love.
Pennies from Heaven. That was one of my favorites.
Yeah, that was from the first Count Basie album. Very good.
Now, I assume that you've been in some of Frank's houses, right? Like the one in Palm Springs?
Yes, I was at the one in Palm Springs the last time I was in Palm Springs. I try to go to Palm Springs every year to visit my dear friend Richard Baker, who lives out there. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we specifically set the date around seeing the great Jack Jones, who lives out there.
Oh, yeah.
That worked out great. Went backstage, talked to Jack. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. I'm really a handsome guy.
Jack is super famous for doing the Love Boat theme.
That's correct.
Have you been in the house in Twin Palms that he and Ava Gardner lived in?
No, I never was there because I didn't make it to Modernism Week yet. If I make it out as I hope to this winter, I will do that tour. I was invited on the tour. I had to cancel. I got sick and I couldn't go out.
Right. Tell us about your Spike books.
Yeah, two things I'd like to talk about here is my writing career. I've been writing all my life since I learned to print. And although I'm best known as a talk show host, over the course of a couple of decades, I've written 4 books. And one of which was optioned for a screenplay by Renee Zellweger. It didn't happen, but she really liked it. But anybody who's getting into their mid-70s, as I was at the time, I realized, my last TV show went off the air called My Generation. And that was produced by the AARP. And I was standing in my living room thinking, I just got in the news. What am I going to do now? And I realized, I'm 74, whatever years old. And I've been on television for decades, and I've been chasing jobs and stuff and getting them and not getting them. I said, people aren't interested in me anymore. If I had a home, like I was still on the Food Network, or still on PBS, then you have a home and you live with it for a long time. But I said, from this point forward, I'm going to be a writer. And I had this idea for a book that would be narrated by a dog who was very funny in his view of humans and their life. So it was like an extraterrestrial being who goes with his master from a small town TV show. The dog is on the TV show. It's called Spike the Wonder Dog. And they go to New York, and they both become very successful in the world of show business. So the first book was The Adventures of Spike the Wonder Dog. And people loved it. It got wonderful reviews in terms of laugh out loud, people said. Then he wrote the follow-up book, which came out a couple months ago, called Spike Unleashed, which picks up, like season 2 in a TV show, picks up from the end of the first book and carries it forward. And I consider Spike Unleashed the best single work of my life. I put a lot into it. The voice of the dog just naturally comes through me. And as any writer could tell you, George, Bill Boggs is not up there with the great ones, but as any writer could tell you, when you have the voice of your central character, you're halfway there. And it just plopped in my head when I started writing the first one.
You also have a YouTube channel?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel that goes back to about 2007. It's free. I'd love people to subscribe to Bill Boggs TV. On Bill Boggs TV are almost 500 clips. Some personal, but my son was a little boy, playing with him. But most of them are interviews with some of the most notable people of the 20th century. Just off the top of my head, Natalie Wood, Sean Connery, Jerry Lewis. Part of the Frank Sinatra interview is there. Burt Lancaster, Shirley MacLaine, a lot of people are on that. Every year they option material, and it's in documentaries. My interview with Little Richard was in both Little Richard documentaries. And that's nice because I make a little money on the side from that. And we all could always use a little money, for ice cream and stuff.
Sure, yeah. Who are some of your favorite interviews, Bill?
Philippe Petit, the High Wire.
The High Wire. I've met him, yes.
Yeah. I interviewed him the morning after he did the walk.
Between the Twin Towers?
Yeah, I have a fear of between the Twin Towers. Thanks for adding that. And I have a fear of heights, so it was a pretty interesting interview, And then I like the second interview I did with Jerry Lewis. Not the first one. The second one was a pretty good interview. And then I had Roy Cohen and Gore Vidal on, debating each other. Let's see, I mentioned Shirley.
Let me ask you a Jerry Lewis question. Maybe you would know. Why did he and Dean Martin break up?
Well, I think they got sick of each other. Jerry was too controlling. Jerry was taking over. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back was Jerry wrote a movie where Dean was a cop in a uniform, and Dean didn't want to play that character. But Dean got sick of Jerry and went on to be a far bigger star.
Yes. And they had their famous reunion on Jerry's muscular dystrophy telethon, facilitated by Frank Sinatra.
That's correct. And if you want to go on YouTube and see that reunion between Martin and Lewis, just type in Martin and Lewis reunion and you'll see it. So much stuff is available, George. That's why I'm glad I have this Bill Boggs TV YouTube channel, because as soon as we put something new on there, people who subscribe get an email. And it may be once every 3 months, you know what I mean? Most of the material that I had in storage is already on there.
Yeah. When you speak at Modernism Week on Sinatra, what are some of the things you'll share with the audience?
Well, the story of meeting him, the story of sneaking into the 500 Club, the story of the time he met my mother, and plus then clips of Frank performing. The story of what he gets when he's singing and knows that he's made emotional connection with people, what that means to him. And then video clips of him singing, his singing.
Oh, cool. Well, that should be a great talk.
Yeah, it's called Memories of Sinatra.
Thanks so much for talking with me, Bill.
George, I really enjoyed it. You took me back, and telling some of those creation stories about my life and my career. Thank you very much, George.
George was chatting about Sinatra with Bill Boggs. Matt Shaw is the author of a new book, American Modern, the first in-depth history of Columbus, Indiana, a small town renowned for its world-class modern architecture. With stunning photographs by Iwan Bad and designed by Studio Lynn, Matt's book explores how this unlikely Midwestern city became a mecca of modernist architecture, showcasing how one company can turn an unremarkable town into a world-class destination. Here's George's conversation with Matt Shaw.
I have known Matt Shaw for a number of years, and I didn't know until reading this book that, Matt, you are a native of Columbus, Indiana. You grew up there.
Yeah, that's right. I went to school in a Norman Fletcher and Walter Gropius elementary school, designed by the Architects Collaborative, and a Harry Weiss middle school. And I used to ride my bike through the yard of the Eros Saarinen Church to get to high school. I got to ride through that Dan Kiley landscape. And so, yeah, I guess marinated in modernism, as some would say.
A kind of beef stew of modernism there, just marinating all the time.
Yeah. So it's such an honor to do this book because it was sort of at once a national project, but also a very local project. So it felt really nice to get to contribute to my hometown and spend some time there as well, working with people there.
How did your family come to Columbus?
Well, my parents grew up in the town, one town over, Greensburg, Indiana, which is a little more of a farming town. And then my dad went to business school at IU and ended up at Cummins in their finance department. So I think his dad had always admired Cummins in the 50s and 60s, and then my dad ended up going there.
Cummins and Columbus have a very important part of this story that factor into your book. So let's start with Columbus 101. Where the heck is this, and why is this town important to architecture?
It's a small town about an hour south of Indianapolis, an hour north of Louisville in southern Indiana. It's a kind of rural area, a little more like Kentucky than Detroit, if you know Indiana. Columbus was a place where a lot of industry kind of popped up along these two rivers. Cummins was one of those industries. And in the first part of the 20th century, it was just one of many. And the Miller family was the owner of Cummins, and they were one of many families there. In the 1950s, alongside the interstate highway system, Cummins really took off because they made diesel engines. And so it's a very American story. They really parallel the American century in a lot of interesting ways. But they make diesel engines, and they grew up into this global behemoth that by the 60s and 70s was a Fortune 500 company. And they really were one of the leaders in that kind of mid-century industrial capitalist modernism in America, alongside IBM, John Deere, et cetera. And so Columbus grew alongside them. And part of that growth was building buildings for this expanding population. And so in the 1950s, Cummins decided to, under the leadership of Irwin Miller, start working with these top leading architects in the US. And so they designed this program where they would pay the architects' fees for any of these architects that they would offer up to either public institutions, nonprofit institutions. They would pay the architects' fees if the client chose from their list. And so over the next 20 years, from about 1954 to 1974, they built almost every major institutional building in town: banks, churches. They built schools, a city hall, a library. And Cummins didn't necessarily pay for every single building, but their leadership is what brought this about. There's about 80 prominent buildings there. And that's what our book tries to capture, is this period where Columbus was basically built by modernism, so to speak, and built by what Irwin Miller called, quote, the best thinking of our time. So he was bringing in these people. You know, he had to bring in the best Harvard MBAs to make Cummins competitive with IBM. And part of the reason they wanted to support this architecture was to bring in the top talent and to make a better place for everyone to live, so that white collar talent would want to come to Columbus. I think that was one side of it. The other side of it was that they just wanted to make a better place in a kind of the best of American kind of tradition. Like, they wanted to build a great community where people wanted to raise their kids. And Irwin Miller's a very religious guy. So I think a lot of this actually has kind of a beautiful religious component to it. There was kind of quest for building an ideal city where everyone was accepted, and they built these schools for even the poorest people in town to come and have the best education they could give them. So there was kind of a great American religious story here too, which I think we've lost a bit in our current time. There's a lot of strands here in Columbus, and that's what this book tries to pick apart, is like all these different kind of strands of the American story that Columbus really parallels.
This philanthropy of supporting modern architecture, was that unique to Cummins, or did other corporations do that too? Because I've never heard about anybody else but Columbus.
Well, in this sense, I think it was pretty innovative. Cummins Foundation, which was formed in the 50s, kind of in the spirit of the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, et cetera. A lot of the ways that they were funding things and working were not unique, but I think it was unique that they applied it to architecture. And since the success of that program, it is surprising that not many other corporations have taken this model up. You know, I think the Walton Foundation is the one that had in Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas. They have very directly came and studied the Cummins Foundation program and have really tried to replicate the design excellence program there. But other than that, I think it's just something that unfortunately hasn't really been evangelized the way that it should be. So hopefully this book can kind of serve as like a model for a kind of a guidebook or a roadmap for people to maybe start to integrate design excellence in a bit different way in their cities and towns.
This was not just a project by you. You were involved very much with Landmark Columbus Foundation and other organizations to put this together and raise funds to put the book together. How did that partnership evolve?
Well, as you said, I grew up there, and so I'd go back there all the time, and it started unfolding a little bit for me, like what was really there, right? As I studied architecture at University of Cincinnati, and so that process for me of like unfolding the stories, and I wanted to share them with people, and I just noticed that there wasn't really a book out there. I started thinking about a book like in 2013 or something, thinking I should do this, and someone said, "Oh, well, there's this Landmark Columbus Foundation that's doing things like that now." I started talking with Richard McCoy there. And he kind of agreed with me that there should be a book, and they've been thinking about that as well. And so we kept talking about it, but I was at Architects Newspaper, so I couldn't really do it. And then the universities came together in 2020, and Richard approached me and said, "Hey, would you like to do your book project for our bicentennial project?" So the book is actually a bicentennial book for the town by Landmark, and then their mission paralleled with our mission, because I had been talking with Ewan Bond, the photographer, about it. And so all of our visions for a project like this were very much in line, and we were able to come together in a really beautiful way. And then the Landmark Columbus Foundation got a grant from the Lilly Endowment in Indianapolis, and it was really a great collaboration. It was really fun and productive every time we'd all get on a call and kind of hash out things like the title or the cover image, where we made these decisions where everyone was happy, and it was really cool. And I think that's why it's been able to appeal to so many different people.
Many of these buildings have been around a long time. Of course, there's some new ones, too. When did Columbus kind of realize that they could make themselves a tourist destination? They could want to get people to come see these things.
I think they started realizing what was going on there, even in the early 60s. Fortune magazine, I think, wrote about in the late 50s. People started taking notice of it. One of the funny archival finds I found was, you probably know someone named Jane Merkel, critic and editor. She was the critic for the Cincinnati Enquirer, but in the late 60s, she was a graduate student at the University of Michigan studying aerocerenim. She had written to Irwin Miller that she wanted to do a book about Columbus. And they took it seriously. She met with some people there and stuff, but it never happened. But there were a couple different letters like that, also from Peter Blake, who I believe was at Architectural Forum.
Yes, and Architecture Plus later on after that.
Yeah, and so there were several of these moments, and it just never happened. But in 1973, they did start the Visitor Center, and they got Paul Rand to do a graphic identity, all these maps and everything. And the Visitor Center is still there today, like really rolling along with the Paul Rand materials and everything. And so they recognized it was a place for tourism. They also recognized very early, and this is to their credit and made my life easier, they started collecting the archival materials from the architects in, I believe, 1967 or 1969, around that time. And so they had a pretty extensive collection of drawings and materials directly from the offices at the time when the offices were still, very robust.
At what point in your life did you realize that Columbus was someplace special? I mean, when you're a kid, it's just where you're growing up. It's just normal. When did you realize it wasn't really normal?
Yeah. People always ask me this. It took me so long to figure it out, but I think this book has really helped. And that is, it's a very normal place. It's about as normal as it gets. The Midwest is known for its normalcy. And so, it was riding your bike around, playing soccer, playing Sega Genesis, whatever. And it was all very normal kind of suburban life. But at the same time, you could tell, I think I could tell that there was something bigger going on. The idea that, these global events and stuff would affect Columbus. I remember during the Gulf War, there was like a lot of security stuff that happened around Cummins and in Columbus because Cummins make engines for the Army.
No, wait a second. I don't understand that. I mean, engines for the Army isn't necessarily a high security item. Why would there be extra protection for that?
I think they were just thinking that there could potentially be a terrorist attack at one of their factories in town. You could tell there was something bigger at stake. You would hear about these kind of global events that would affect Cummins stock, or, there'd be layoffs because of this or that. And so you could tell that there was something bigger going on there. And also these architects coming in from all over the place. My dad worked at Cummins in the Kevin Roche headquarters there. And I remember going there and just thinking that it felt like a very special place. Parquet floors and mirrors. It felt like kind of a nightclub or something. And it smelled like tobacco. So there was kind of this like air of excellence or something that you could feel everywhere. I mean, even just the beautiful landscapes. I could tell when I was younger, and then I got to school, of course, and really understood like who these architects were, like what these buildings and styles meant. So
when people come to Columbus, they can actually visit a lot of these places. What are some of the sites they can visit?
Well, the visitor center has a great tour. You can go by foot around downtown. And a lot of people are surprised when you get to Columbus how close everything is together. You can walk around downtown for a couple hours and see about 15 amazing structures, including several National Historic Landmarks. And a lot of them are like adjacent to each other. You just spin in a circle and see 5 or 6 buildings.
Wow.
Especially like in the Library Plaza area or in the downtown. There's a bus tour where they'll take you to some of the more obscure places that are outside downtown. And then if you time your visit right, you can go into the churches when they're having a service. Just make sure to be very respectful of that. Maybe catch it after the service when people are hobnobbing. The schools, unfortunately, used to be very open and aren't anymore because schools just can't be open today. But you can also see so many buildings on that tour. Another one is the Miller House. You got to see the Miller House and Gardens, which is run by the Indianapolis Museum of Art now and is really carefully curated as a kind of house museum. Very much intact and very amazing to see.
That's an Eero Saarinen design, right?
Yeah, that's Eero Saarinen. Alexander Girard did the interiors and Dan Kiley did the gardens. And so it's kind of this total work of art. Like that.
That's an impressive team of people to work on your house.
Yeah, I think it really demonstrates Irwin Miller's commitment to excellence and his kind of quest to get the best people involved and the best thinking and create these really special places where everything's kind of pushed forward to the maximum.
Irwin Miller, I think, had a lake cabin too. Whatever happened to that?
Yeah. That's up in Muskoka, Canada, Ontario. That's a place his family had been going for years and years. And that's kind of a big part of the story is that, he was just another member of the Miller family in many ways, the Irwin Sweeney Miller family. They'd been going up there since, I think, the 1890s to like hunt and fish. But, as a modern man, he got Eero Saarinen to design this little lake cabin that is a beautiful little riff on the kind of vernacular architecture up there. I've never been up there, but I hear it's a lot like Finland, which is where Eero Saarinen and Elio were from. Simple kind of lakeside cottage architecture, but of course Eero Saarinen took it and made it his own, and he worked with Girard there as well.
As you had access to all the archives about Columbus, did you discover any remarkable buildings that didn't get built?
There were several, yes. There were smaller ones. Gunnar Bierkerts did a little shopping center plan out for west of town, which eventually became this kind of commercial strip. But Bierkerts' plan was pretty funky. It was very modern. There was a Paul Kennan design for a golf club and tennis center that did end up getting built, but they didn't build his design. They built a very simple little shed kind of building. One of the interesting things in the book, too, are the kind of buildings that didn't get built, but did get built, so to speak, like the original design for something. Like one of my favorite examples is First Baptist Church by Harry Weiss. He originally wanted to design this big concrete brutalist building in a kind of Romanesque style, but the congregation said that they didn't really like concrete. They wanted it to be brick and stone and more classic kind of natural materials. And so he toned it down and made what I think is one of the finest pieces of architecture there, is First Baptist. It still has that kind of blocky Romanesque form, but a slate roof and a really nice hand brick exterior. So it's an example of where some of the biggest, best ideas in modernism came, but they got modulated a bit by the rural Indiana community. So the small town vibes didn't get overrun by, this huge hulking heroic architecture. It kind of was a beautiful sort of top-down, bottom-up collaboration that is what makes the architecture there really beautiful. Irwin Miller also had an example of that. Irwin Miller was writing to Harry Weiss and said, this office for our Purity stores, which was another one of their businesses, it looks just like the Weaver House, which just looks just like the new hotel in Philadelphia, which looks just like every other building in every magazine. Why don't you take another stab at it and see what you can come up with? So this idea that glass boxes were sort of too foreign or too modern, I guess, is why you don't see a ton of them in Columbus. And so that aesthetic of like brick and this kind of Scandinavian aesthetic worked better in Columbus. And that's why I think you see it there. The other thing that was not built was Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. I think Denise was the lead on that project, actually. They were commissioned to design a highway strip, basically. So from the highway exit off I-65 into downtown is about a mile and a half. And they were commissioned to design not only the pedestrian areas and the crosswalks, but also the street signage. They were even commissioned to design a series of Bigfoot gas stations, which is a local chain owned by a family, the Johnson family, who are still very active in town and help with this book in many ways. The Bigfoot stations would have been pretty hilarious. And they're in the book and you can see them. They're very Venturian, kind of at his finest. Also, Emilio Ambas was supposed to design at the same time a pretty fantastic bridge with hanging plantings and a music score by Peter Gabriel that would be broadcast over FM radio. And there'd be bumps in the road that played a tune. And it was just this sort of like whole fantastic thing that I think was maybe a little bit too much. And it also at that scale, they were taking federal funding for this Indiana Department of Transportation projects. And I think it was just a little bit too much to get through at those huge dollar amounts, but it would have been pretty amazing.
That would be pretty amazing to be driving over the pavement and having it sort of play a tune on your car.
Yeah, I think there's a highway in Germany that has that, and it works.
In addition to the research that you did, I understand that you were able to use our archives to do some of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times there would be small clippings in the archives, and it wasn't always quite clear the full article. And so sometimes we would look up things in your database. And it was very nice, too, to be able to just link to a PDF as you were writing the book. In the footnotes, you can link to the PDF rather than having to look up something. So it's such a great resource, and the way it's organized is so amazing. There was even a time, towards the end, we worked with the great graphic designer, Alex Lynn, who really helped push the book visually into places that we wouldn't have otherwise. And one of those was kind of at the end, he started saying, like, you need an encyclopedic density of images here to help illustrate the story. And so we started looking in mad rush of photo research, finding anything we could all over the internet. We would look on your database and find photos and just take screen grabs, which are in the public domain. So we were taking screen grabs of U.S. Modernist PDFs, and then obviously just citing Library of Congress, because the fact that Korab donated his whole entire collection to the Library of Congress, it's all just in the public domain. We can use it and cite Library of Congress. So that was kind of a fun moment where I was like, thanks, George. We really appreciate it, George.
One of the things I noticed about your book, and we can't show this to everybody because it's audio, but you can see that there's these little bands of color here that sort of represent the differences between the big photos of your photographer and the text section. So how did you choose to organize it in that way? Because I think it's very effective.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, that was a big question mark. We had these ideas for chapters and we knew we had all these images, but it was sort of like, how do you do justice to both the text and the story and Ewan's images? And we kind of, over time, came up with this system of shifting back and forth between history and the present in a way. So you read about chapter one, you read about that history, and then you kind of see it unfold as what's there today. Alex designed a system. He's very organizational in his thinking. And so a lot of the design moves are really to just try to wrangle these really three different types of content: historic images, Ewan's images, and text. And so you can see there's these little film strips at the bottom of this page that reference what's in the Ewan portfolios. And so you kind of get a glimpse of the historic photos and those film strips, what's coming next. And so I'm glad that you think it's effective, because it was definitely one of those things. It was overwhelming, all this content and how to make it make sense. I think Alex did a great job of bringing that together. All the Ewan images are full bleed, so you can tell what's new and what's
yes.
not.
Yeah, it's a very visually effective as a book.
Thank you.
The book is American Modern, Architecture, Community, Columbus, Indiana. Thanks for talking with me, Matt. This is quite an achievement.
Oh, thanks, George. Yeah, it's been a few years in the making, and we've had some amazing, amazing partners on it. So I want to thank everyone who was involved.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger. And by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Reliable is her middle name. Or it could be Pam, we don't really know. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I'll be back soon with another celebrity-adjacent edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.